Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people that can help us understand human decision making and how we can influence it for the better. On this episode, I'm speaking to Kelly Peters, who is the CEO of BEWorks, a behavioural science consultancy that helps businesses solve strategic problems using scientific thinking. If you've read any of Dan Ariely's books, and if you haven't, you really should, links to those in the show notes, you'll have some idea of what BEWorks is about. As we explore in our discussion, Dan is one of Kelly's co-founders of the company. Kelly and I talk about how she moved from banking into behavioural science, the project she's working on with clients, and her thoughts on what COVID-19 means for business. It's a really positive, uplifting conversation, and Kelly has a fascinating backstory which provides some really interesting insights. I think you're going to really enjoy this, so let's get on with the show. Please enjoy my discussion with Kelly Peters. Kelly, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. I have to say, I'm super excited for your listeners because you bring such incredible energy to your podcast, and I think that's such a treat, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, let's thank you so much. Let's see if we could take it downhill from there, but that'll be me doing that, not you. I'd love it if you could just start talking about your background and how you kind of got into behavioral science, because I think it's fascinating, and it chimes, I think, with a lot of the backgrounds of some of my listeners.
I'd love to tell the story. Basically, it's kind of funny. When I went to university, I didn't want to get a degree in a particular discipline. Now that I'm a parent of a 17-year-old, I'm like, I can't believe my parents' patience with me and the whole thing. But, I had these radical ideas of like, how can you get a degree in one, vertical? It's like you're putting, craft plastic wrap around cheese slices. You shouldn't do that with this precious knowledge. And I want to do this thing, interdisciplinary studies. And that wasn't a thing. They didn't grant a degree for interdisciplinary studies. Now it's a thing. But in the 80s, that wasn't a thing. So I still did it anyways. And I was like that and got to study just philosophy and theory and really enjoy the process of learning and learning about how we think. And in particular, I was interested at the time in technology. I wasn't a geek in that way, other than just being fascinated by it all. When I was even younger, just to go back into my childhood, and maybe some of your listeners are as old as me, and those who aren't might not know what I'm talking about. But my parents got a VCR, video cassette recorder. I don't know if I have to explain that.
I'll tell you what. I'll put a link in the show notes to this because I think I'm guessing most people will know, but yeah, we'll put a link in there. It's what predated DVDs, if you even remember what those were. Yes,
and so they got this giant, machine, right? And for my family, it actually changed everything. This machine changed everything. So some things happened. So we got the machine, and we got a piece of furniture that this machine sat on. Then my father turned the carport. Built it all up, and we turned it into a giant movie room.
Right.
And then my mom's a movie buff, and then suddenly kind of everything else started to change. There were movie nights. She put up movie posters. I was responsible for running this machine. I was the one in charge of recording the Ted Turner network and recording those black and white movies for her. And then we would watch these things. We had stacks of these tapes growing. And seeing how my family changed, seeing this dynamic of these social events around this machine always intrigued me. And, as I sort of served as this projectionist, I was just so intrigued by how it changed our family dynamic. And that was kind of that original seed for me about how machines can change our lives. And so when I went to university, I was still interested in that question and studying the philosophy of how technology influences us and can change our behavior. So fast forward after university with a head full of ideas and no degree, I got lucky. That I was, right there at the early days of the internet, and I knew a lot about that technology. I knew what was going on in the space, but that was before many companies did. And I had met a professor who was involved in the computer training business, and they were looking at starting an internet training business. And I just happened to be at the right place at the right time and was given the opportunity to be the person to help build this practice and start meeting with business leaders to tell them what the internet was and answer the question for many of them of should they be there and how might it change the behavior of their customers and employees. So it's just continued from there.
Wow. I mean, so much to unpack. I loved your kind of comment around education, because I think that's really interesting about this sort of idea that we kind of force people to make choices. And I find it fascinating. You start off when you're younger and you can do what the hell you like, right? And you're allowed to be creative. And then we force you to select something. And that's so unnatural because frankly, there are some people that know they want to be a doctor at age 5, but the majority of us have no clue whatsoever. And we're required to make these choices that in theory, could lock, in the old world, they would have locked you into a certain path. And I love that depiction because I think it reflects a real sort of human desire of like curiosity. And why should we know that early on? Because as adults, we don't even know what we want to do. And as you point out with your career, it's, luck and a whole host of other things. So I think that's a really fascinating insight into something that is sort of, is an unnatural process that we force on people, which I think is highly interesting from a behavioral perspective, because I think loads of other processes that are designed are, to use a loose term, inhumane.
Yeah, that's right. And it's one of those early decisions that we have to make in our life before we're actually prepared to learn how to be good decision makers, to even really have a good understanding of what our preferences are and what the consequences of those choices are. So we do have so many people who end up choosing and starting off on career paths that ultimately they don't like. And if it's okay, I have another story that
I please do. I love these.
I like to share. When I was young, my family, I have an older brother. We were close with my cousins. 2 of them are also boys and 1 girl. But basically, there was kind of this very sporty culture that I grew up in and wanted to be competitive in. And so I became a tomboy and didn't want to ever be one-upped by the guys. And we were off to the Bahamas in a boat from Florida. And my aunt's hat blew off of her head. And we were in the middle of the ocean. There was no land, hadn't seen land for hours, just pure ocean. And everyone sort of like leaned over and, they were looking at the hat that was quickly going into the distance. And without hesitating, I just climbed up on the side of the boat, jumped in the middle of the ocean and swam towards this hat. And at one moment, as I was, just kind of doing the strokes across the water, I thought to myself, what the hell am I doing? Sharks, whales, men.
It's really dangerous, right?
Right? Drowning waves, all of that, and got the hat. But when I grabbed that hat, and I still feel that surge of power and accomplishment in my hand, and I held up that hat, and everyone is still just like aghast on the side of this boat. I held up that hat and I swam back victorious, like it was probably one of the biggest trophies that I've ever held in my life. And it was that moment for me that I felt we can take risk. We can push ourselves beyond the bounds that we're comfortable with. We can jump into these dark, mysterious oceans. And most of the time, we're going to be okay. And I've used that as a metaphor for me in terms of other times where I saw that hat going further and further away, and it was an opportunity, but it wasn't going to last. And was I going to be the person that jumped off the boat to get it? And it's helped me think about making those kinds of choices.
Wow. I love that because there's clearly an alternative universe where it goes horribly wrong. It's not the smartest decision, but I love the philosophy of kind of like, well, this is the moment I'm going to grab it, and what the hell, right? And it's gut instinct kicking in rather than any kind of deliberate. Because if you thought about it for too long, the opportunity would have passed.
Yeah. First of all, I didn't have time to think about it too long because, like, really, the distance would have become increasingly dangerous, or I would have lost sight of the hat. But then, it's different when there's shark fins swimming around the boat already, right? So, I know enough about the ocean that isn't the case, that there's, sharks with their mouth open, just waiting for, somebody to jump in the water. So
that would be a really lousy shark strategy. Like, hanging around on the off chance that someone might do what you did, right? It's not a great strategy.
Exactly. So I think in our minds, there are way more sharks swimming around.
Right.
And then even still, there's still ways that we can improve our risk perception and our risk appetite and our risk taking. And we can use, that analogy of like the 13-year-old deciding to jump in and think about those different scenarios and why and how and when to act fast, but breaking down, do I have the right risk perception about this? Do I have a risk appetite? Am I ready, willing, and able to go for it? And then do I have that ability to handle that risk should it actually manifest? Those are the things that we need to think about. And all the research shows we tend to have lots of errors in those calculations.
Right. We are not particularly well equipped for that stuff. And going back to your kind of career, so you're teaching people about the internet. When you said internet training, right, my initial reaction was, oh, she's teaching people via the internet, but you're not. You're teaching people about the internet. So this is like literally this is Web 101, right? This
was Web 101 in the early 90s.
And so how do we get from that into banking?
The first thing that I did as a consultant was working with different companies, which led me to an opportunity to join a really cool startup. And that startup was the new media division of the largest publishing company in Canada. And I had the opportunity to work with Mavericks, who had been in the publishing industry for many years. They knew the ins and outs of the traditional publishing industry. And that's at that precipice between how we think about media today versus what it used to be. I was right there when that cleave happened. And I was there with people who had been in that industry and also believed that it was going to transform, whether those companies were ready for it or not. And they were the ones who put the .com behind the name of that traditional, masthead of those of the newspapers and the magazines and even the TV stations that were owned by this conglomerate. And being a part of that let me see how technology fundamentally changes behavior. And we've seen overnight how we consume our news. And I'm curious how many of your listeners still subscribe to a newspaper. Those numbers are probably very low. And we might not have ever predicted that we would completely lose the newspaper, especially in those early years. But many of us have. And we explored all kinds of business models that would work, that we thought would work, that we'd hope would work. And ultimately, that industry is still struggling to monetize itself. And I knew enough about technology to have this idea, like, it won't really work until we have a micropayment capability. And we don't have a micropayment capability, and we still don't have a micropayment capability. And that industry is still struggling. And one area that I saw that wasn't struggling was banking. I saw the banks put .com behind their name and had the opportunity to join a bank that was interested in the same questions. How do we build this? How do we do this? How do we change people's behavior to adopt those channels? Because they saw things like the efficiency gains that could happen from having a digital channel, but how do we actually encourage that behavior? And so I joined a bank in 1999 and then spent about 12 years in the banking sector. And it was interesting because I always had one foot sort of in academia. I never really left that world of looking at the work that academics were doing and the questions that they were exploring. And they were particularly useful through my career because sometimes the cutting edge questions that I had the privilege of working on in my strategy and innovation roles, some of those questions or the fundamental components of them were being explored by academics. And so that's where I had to turn to. The competitive landscape is circular, right? But the academic world sometimes was answering those fundamental questions. And one of the first projects that I was assigned by my boss was to put a mortgage application online. And that was incredibly difficult. First of all, there wasn't a competitor there was no mortgage online. Now all that stuff's everywhere. But I had and I'm old enough that I was there that first time. And I had to think about things like, first of all, what do I know about that mortgage experience? It's brutal. It's complicated. What's an amortization? What's a term? How does all of this work? Variable versus fixed mortgage. I mean, these questions are so complex. And how is a person supposed to do that alone? So I started to look to how do people think about things like risk, and started to incorporate that into my work. How do we do things like build behavioral scoring models that work without that human interaction with an account manager who used to evaluate the credit character of an individual? How do we build empirical models that enable good, reliable, predictive credit scoring? So that turning to academia for those insights and then applying that for these real world scenarios were the foundations for me of doing what I'm doing today, or still doing, basically.
Wow. I mean, that is so much to unpick there. But it's fascinating because, as you describe banking, historically, that really was a business that involved humans working. There was a human-human interface. So if you wanted to borrow money, you would go and have a conversation with someone, and that human judgment became absolutely critical. So on the one hand, really, really engaged business. On the other hand, you've got bureaucratic hell, as outlined by your comment on the mortgage application. I remember filling in, and you kind of go, it was like sort of almost the best of customer facing business, because you could speak to a human being who understood you. And in the old days, your bank manager knew who you were, combined with the worst of bureaucracy, which is you're going through, 7 shades of hell, where you're dealing with complexity of things you don't really understand. And of course, you're doing it infrequently. So I find it a really fascinating space for these dynamics. And of course, what you're talking about there is transitioning kind of that process into the digital world. So on the one hand, it's a great opportunity, and you can see the thing. On the other hand, as you say, taking a process that's structured in the way it was and digitizing it is really difficult. And I think there's something really fascinating about that kind of cusp, because it ought to be relatively easy because banks are all about data, and yet clearly it's not.
That's right. That's actually one of the threads that led to the inception of BEWorks. So when BEWorks was founded, there were 5 partners. And one of the partners had a question about in his world, he was accountable for looking at large value transaction trading of securities. And he was interested in what those large value transactions would look like online between 2 counterparties that didn't know one another. And he, like me, would look to academia for scientists looking at these questions from a foundational perspective. And in particular, one of the things that he was trying to get an answer on is, how do you facilitate trust between 2 parties in a potentially non-reversible transaction, intermediated not by a human being and bankers and lawyers on each side, but instead intermediated by technology. And so my partner, Doug Steiner, had looked to the research and came across the work done by Dan Ariely. And he called Dan Ariely, and he was very generous with his time and his insights. And then Doug called him back later and said, can I talk to you about something else? Do you typically give your insights away for free like this? And Dan is a complete sweetheart, and was like, sure, yes, I do. And Doug said, but there's an opportunity for this to be a business, a consulting practice, and that became one of the fundamental kind of moments for us, for BEWorks being born.
Wow. I mean, it's beautiful, and he does always strike me as being a really just genuinely nice person, right? Trying to do amazing things for society, and we can see that in what he's doing with Corona at the moment in Israel. And but I love that there's a certain sort of academic naivety which I think is lovely, because it's you don't generally historically you haven't gone into academia to make loads of money.
Yeah.
And so it's genuinely about intellectual curiosity, discovery. So I love that kind of thing. So go, has it ever occurred to you that there's a business proposition here? And then we pivot. And so you create BEWorks as a sort of collective, all coming from slightly different backgrounds with a view of sort of how do we take this thing into the quote unquote real world?
That's right. Our vision was, how do we actually build a management consulting practice that does creative work, that works on very complex solutions, but that is dedicated to this marriage of behavioral insights and the scientific method, and being very, very rigorous about that application. And so what that means is, instead of just taking the research from the academic world and then trying to apply it, instead, the premise of the business is, how do we help our clients actually have the ability to design and run their own experiments and start to become their own scientific laboratories? How do we turn business leaders into scientific thinkers? How do we take the beautiful and powerful philosophy of science, where we evolve innovation and the desire for innovation into a very systematic process that adheres to the scientific method? And it starts with curiosity, but then it moves into, what is our variable of interest? It then moves into, how do we define that in an operationalizable way so that we're all on the same page, so that when we say trust, when I say let's improve trust through this customer experience, we all mean the same. We have to mean the same thing. Otherwise, how do we evaluate the quality
right.
of strategy? So I'm saying this will work. You're saying that'll work. We're not actually talking about the same goal in the first place. How do we then develop and agree upon measures? Science is very heavily weighted into the substance for these empirical measures. So now we have the foundational planks of bringing scientific practice to life. And it's hard, but it's easy in a business world. And now our language needs to continue to change. It's about developing a hypothesis. About instead in the business world, we're so used to I think this is going to work. Let's do this. In my experience or in my gut, this is going to work. And we're so used to that language in the business world, where it's we use things to prove ourselves right. I'm gathering ideas.
Right.
I've done this before, and that's evidence, right? We pretend that that's a fact. But the beauty of science is actually instead having a much greater humility, which is potentially very democratizing and enables diversity, when instead of, I think that, and I'm using my power as a leader, instead I'm now saying it's my intuition that such and such might work. So now we open ourselves up to exploration together, to debate together, and now we set up a foundation by which we can run experiments and test our hypotheses. And we've agreed upon those measures. We've agreed upon those goals. And so now just those fundamental elements from science can be brought into business and to improve that quality of innovation. It's easy and it's hard, like I said, because it requires a change of language. It requires a reframing of our ego. It requires a different way of bringing our ideas to life through the rigors of experimentation. And so that's the premise of BEWorks, is that we can, instead of merely relying on the insights of others and just applying those, instead we're bringing the practice and the discipline of scientific thinking inside companies, set that up as our foundational framework, and then now it's just about bringing the behavioral insights to life for that different context. And there's so much work to do. There's so many things we still need to learn. In what circumstances does trust work? What are the factors that improve compliance? There's so many wonderful things to learn. And we need business leaders to have that confidence in themselves as scientific thinkers to help advance knowledge.
And it's really interesting when you talk about that, because I sort of think, companies, we've seen lots of examples of research and development. If you're in pharmaceuticals or you're in the automotives industry, R&D equals we'll try some things out in the physical world to see how that plays out. So we'll test, how do these chemicals react together? How can we make a car more cheaply, more effectively using? And so there's a lot of testing and these things that go on. But when it comes to the kind of cognitive space and human beings, we tend not to do that. And it tends to be sort of, reliance on tried and tested. As you say, that's the way we've always done things, or I didn't get to this position without, and we're going to do it my way. And I think it's really interesting that firstly, that discipline of testing stuff out hasn't really permeated into management of the businesses in terms of the human side. And then the second bit is, to the extent that people do think about these things, there is a little bit of, what a science, okay, this behavioral stuff's interesting. Let me just pull a piece of research off the shelf. And of course, we talk a lot about replication crisis and, the challenges. And I sort of look at it and go, something may have worked in a lab in certain circumstances with a student, and we can learn things from that. But actually, that doesn't mean it necessarily will work in your organization, your context. So you do need to test it again. So there's this strange piece where either we don't do any testing at all, or it's just I'll just read a book by someone, or I'll grab some research off the shelf and I'll just roll that out. And we don't have that natural curiosity around people in a way that we do when it comes to physical things. And I think it's really interesting when you talk about sort of dragging all of those things together, because I think we are leaving so much value on the table as a society and as businesses by not doing that.
Absolutely agree with that. And I think that there's such an incredible opportunity to really challenge what businesses think that they know. And so many of these things are actually built in as just assumptions. So for instance, banks will say, trust is our most valuable asset. Okay. Well, what do you actually know about trust? How do you define it? How do we measure it? How do we see that we are, in fact, executing on that? And to what extent are we actually earning people's trust and maintaining people's trust? So there's a lot of these things that we assume about our business, but never really have taken the time to dig deeper, to understand a really good definition that works for that context. And then systematically, if that is our most important assets, then our project should always have that as a fundamental measure. Are we increasing it? Are we harming it? And what does that look like? So again, that's where that discipline of scientific thinking can really be challenging for an organization. But at the same time, it has the potential to facilitate curiosity of like, oh, wait a second, what does that really mean? And maybe our most fundamental assets are something else. How do you? Right. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting you talk about, banks and trust. If you go and look at buildings that banks used to operate out of, and I'm thinking particularly in places like Chicago, where you've got the lovely old buildings. And in fact, there's a good example. There's a bank called Northern Trust, right? So it's in the name. And then you look at the building and the outside of it, and it looks like, it's designed to promote all of those things, right? You can trust us to look after your physical assets because look at this building that we've invested money in. And if the outside of the building looks this secure, you can bet the inside is your stuff is safe with us and you can trust us to look after your assets. And of course, as the business model shifted, that physical edifice is irrelevant because there is their main business isn't guarding physical assets. It's a lot of digital assets and various other things. And I think it's fascinating that there's a lot of, we focus a lot on history. And, we've been around since 18 whatever, and here's our thing. And Wells Fargo being another example. Let's have a nice little sort of coach and some horses and things to demonstrate that we're really old. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And we carry this stuff on, but we haven't really tested that stuff out and say, is that what we're about nowadays? Is that important? Does it matter? Right? Is that still a relevant consideration? Could we be something else? And I think these are great challenges, particularly with what we're going through at the moment, where there are some fundamental realignments of priorities and focuses and things. I think you raise a really fascinating point.
Yeah, that's right. And I love how you brought that back to the symbol that we used to have about what trust actually looked like. And in that case, there was utility between the conveyance of physical strength and the vault and the actual protection of the money that was held in the bank. And that metaphor no longer applies. And that's not necessarily the question that consumers have on their mind, or it's manifests itself in a very different way.
And that's scary, right? For particularly businesses that have been around a long time, where and I sort of see this both in terms of business strategies, but also the senior people within these organizations who have grown up in a certain processes in a certain world, who in some cases are ill-equipped to handle the dynamics that we're seeing going on nowadays. And if you've played a particular game to get you to that senior position, you followed a particular path, that's what you're programmed to do. And I see the same, personal strategies, business strategies, I see the same thing. And there's this very strange piece where you can get disintermediated very, very quickly nowadays if you're not able to adapt. And so what you're talking about here really is survival. And this isn't about sort of finding new opportunities. This is like, if you don't look at this stuff, there may well be someone coming to eat your lunch and then some very, very quickly.
That's right. And psychology can be this powerful source of innovative concepts that haven't seen the light of day in organizations and can help people really think about their customers in a very different way and their employees in a very different way.
And what are your thoughts on what we're seeing at the moment? I mean, clearly this is a time of massive amounts of flux. We're all having interesting thoughts around, what's important to us and where we want to go. And there's fears and aspirations and you sort of 2020 is throwing curveballs like nothing else. What are your thoughts on what we're seeing at the moment? How businesses are reacting or not reacting to that, and where does the future take us with all the things you're talking about?
Yeah, it's definitely a period of fundamental change. And it's always interesting, sometimes I'm like, okay, well, what's really changing? Like what? Because it's a cliche. Like all my life, I've been hearing like, oh, it's a period of fundamental change. Oh, it's fundamental change. The internet. Oh, it's fundamental change. So it's like, okay, well, we're always changing. So what are the ways that are different? And sometimes I would say that they're less glorious than radical transformation, but there is still change, and it has an impact. I was having a very interesting conversation with the leader of a massive consumer packaged goods company, and she's dealing with fundamental change right now about how people shop. Now, originally, that question was e-commerce was changing how people were shopping, but now we have another big transition in terms of how people are shopping because of safety and people's perception of safety. And so they don't feel comfortable going into physical stores. They want to buy things online that they would never have bought online before. Or they're using the new hybrid model, the pickup services that they had never used before. And the behavior is changing incredibly quickly. So services that they've been offering for a long time are now being picked up exponentially. So their questions are complex because how do we help people buy these products through these channels that they might have had to have a touch and feel interaction with them? Brand protection and preservation matters, but it's harder to maintain that in some e-commerce channels. And then also the questions around Now that you put people in an e-commerce setting, there might be more competition amongst other e-commerce channels. And so now you're potentially losing that strength of that relationship with the customer. And now you're opening yourselves up to now new forms of competition where you used to have reliable traffic into your store. Now as that e-commerce site becomes the more important channel, now your competition set changes to different channels. And so the questions are, how do we compete in this arena? And then what habits are we potentially setting customers up for in the long term? So there are changes in behavior that are happening now. Which ones will stay?
And there's something interesting you described there around, businesses had set themselves up with optionality around certain pieces that we weren't using. And suddenly we kind of catch up to where they were, because we suddenly realized that's a good thing to do. So I think there's a sort of fascinating, and the video conferencing, another good example where that's just taken off. The technology's been there, but behaviorally we kind of weren't, it was adopted in certain circles, but it's now widespread. It's now a genuine consumer product as opposed to just a sort of business product. And I think there's some fascinating things here where sort of what this is doing is accelerating things that were probably predictable and going to happen anyway, but we're sort of being forced to change our habits. It's almost like, you go to the doctor and they tell you get a very stark medical and it says you need to change your way, and suddenly we're forced to quickly adapt, or something happens, I don't know, we burn our house down by mistake or something. So there's these fundamental things where I sort of think to your point around everybody's talking about massive amounts of change. In a way, if we look at where we're at, there are lots of things that were probably going to happen anyway. They've just been accelerated much more quickly because of this external pressure on us.
Yeah, it's right. And this is one of the things that's so interesting is when we're talking with companies, we've had different projects that started in the early days of COVID-19. And it was like, we have to put things on hold. And, because that behavior, and a lot of our work is actually doing field experiments. And it's like the thing that we're looking for won't actually, it won't seem the same. Things will be different. And we've had to talk to our clients about, hey, this is actually potentially, hopefully, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to understand consumer behavior. So we're working with a different CPG, the consumer packaged goods company, about a goal that they have to reduce food waste. It's one of the projects that they've taken to contribute to the UN sustainability goals, and they're very, very committed as a company to have a social impact. And so, looking at these ways to change people's food waste is a big project. Now, with COVID-19, especially in the early days, we had this issue of stockpiling, people not going shopping.
Right, it's the opposite, right?
So are people buying more? Are they buying less? And how are they eating? And how are we managing our food consumption? And so it becomes a very interesting question. Restaurants are still closed. We're doing much of our own cooking. We're doing takeout. We stockpiled at the grocery store. There's all kinds of changes happening right now in our kitchens. What an incredible opportunity as researchers, as a company in that space, to have empirical studies, not just wait it out, but instead we decided to pause the original project, go all the way in to understanding what's actually changing in consumer behavior, what's changing for the better, what's changing for the worse. And so we found things like people are doing more planning. People are shopping much more carefully than they had in the past. People are doing significantly more meal planning, and many people are cooking that just never did very well in the kitchen. That wasn't something that they enjoyed. More people are cooking than ever. More people are actually learning how to cook and exploring new recipes. And so with that, we've got some wonderful habits that are being established. And then the big question is, how can we help people sustain those good behaviors around planning, around cooking, around carefully calibrated shopping, so that we can overall, find the silver linings in this period of the pandemic.
And what's your, and I recognize this is a big question and one should never try and predict things too much, but let's go for it anyway. When we look at sort of periods of change, and be that, public transport strikes or other things that, or weather related issues where there's change forced on people. Have you got a sense at the moment of what might stick and what is going to revert? Because there's a sort of theory that, once this, and whatever this going away means is another interesting question. But there's a sort of theory that people go, but everything has changed. It's never going to go back the way it was, which I think is extreme. Equally, we're just going to go, we're going back to our old ways. Nothing will stick, I think is also not true. We're going to learn from this experience. Have you got a sense of things that are likely to sort of stick and where it might not, or is it too early to say?
Well, I think that's the power of research. So it's amazing, but we've had to insist that our clients stop doing what they were doing and actually look at now in a way with rigor that they've never looked at now. What are people doing now? Because it is changing. Let's look at what people are doing now. Let's look at how it's changing, and let's figure out what we can do as companies and our workers and governments as well to help sustain those good behaviors, to learn from the bad behaviors and the negative stuff that's crept up. So it's an empirical question. If we approach this in a data gathering and gather those observations, so we can go beyond our intuition. So I have some answers, and of course there's so much more research out there that we'll be able to start to compile it all. But we do see changes in behavior around how. So first of all, the example that I just gave, how people are what we're doing in the kitchen is changing. We see people doing more cooking, which can lead to healthier outcomes. It can lead to reduced food waste. We see better planning happening in the kitchen. So that's definitely one of the domains where we've got some change. So will we resort back to eating out, prepared foods and surrender cooking altogether? I don't know. I've seen far too many pictures on Instagram of people baking bread to think that they're not going to go back to, maintaining some of those wonderful new behaviors that have been adopted. I don't know how much. It's hard to predict how much, but my intuition would suggest that there have been some good behaviors and some of those will last. And what will we do individually, and what will the companies that benefit from those, what will they do to help sustain those behaviors? Another area, and this one is far more difficult for us to talk about, but is around financial distress. Unfortunately, so many of our colleagues have reduced employment or lost employment or lost other self-employment income. And of course, this is incredibly tragic and outrageously difficult stress for people to deal with. And how much longer? How much longer are we going to have to deal with this? And it's brutal. And unfortunately, part of this is requiring a very radical reduction in our spending. It's requiring us to reprioritize our spending at levels that financial advisors have been yammering at us to do all along. Spend less, save more. We know this stuff, and now it's thrust upon us. And of course, I hope that we, as we emerge from the pandemic, as humanity has emerged from wars and pandemics in the past, we will be able to restore our economy and get our lives restored. And, maybe that's 6 months from now, maybe that's a year from now, maybe that's 18 months from now. And all of those numbers feel very long and very, very difficult. But we might learn some good things. I'll give an example. My Italian grandmother survived the Depression, and she would do things like cook the greens on beets. Some garlic, some olive oil, everything. There was no waste. And there were these values and behaviors that she adopted because of what she went through in the Great Depression. will we learn will we finally adopt some fundamental behaviors that we needed to have all along around our lifestyle, around our values, around prioritizing what's important in terms of spending? So right now, many banks, for instance, in Canada, the banks have done things like allow people to defer the principal payments on their mortgages. But what are we kicking the can down the road towards? Are people making the fundamental changes that they need to embrace everything, radical lifestyle changes, in order to, first of all, catch up on those payments later, but also just improve their financial resilience? And I don't think that the financial services industry is helping people enough. Yes, we're doing these kind of Band-Aid things, and that's great. But the more fundamental discussions around that lifestyle adjustment need to happen. And this is a crucial time for us to figure out that radical recalibration and what will we sustain even after we get our jobs back. We spend too much, we save too little, we have to do better in order to survive more black swans or gray rhinos, as this event has been characterized as. So spending and overall lifestyle planning would be a second category. And the third category where we do see change is in the area of health, and understanding how important it is to engage in normal hygiene practices that can help us reduce our exposure to other common coronaviruses, not COVID-19, but quote unquote the common cold and influenza viruses, through a better understanding of germ theory and taking into account those practices that we need to have around things like hand washing. So maybe we will have better hygiene practices, and maybe we will start to take other steps to improve our health. Unfortunately, there's also a negative side to this, which is, how have your exercise routines been affected? Some people are not engaging at the same pace that they used to, or not engaging in healthy exercise at all. We have very good data to support the fact that we can go outside. It's safe. It's okay to go for walks. It's okay to go for runs. It's time to start bringing those things back into our lives. And if we're high risk, we can wear a mask to protect ourselves in that environment. It's time to get exercising again. So that is a behavior that we need people to engage in to protect their health. So those are three domains that have fundamentally changed, and we need to see how we sustain the good and potentially undo some of the bad. That right. The study.
That's really interesting, and I think, as you were talking, I was like, that is a hell of a lot of stuff to process. Right. And there's and the one thing that kind of came through as I was listening to you was sort of the concept of learning. And I think we're kind of learning a lot about ourselves and what's important to us and what's not important. What do we need? What do we not need? And I think this is sort of, it feels like it's an enforced pause in some respects, recognizing some people are incredibly busy on really important things. But, for a lot of people, it's been a kind of like a reflection on, relationships that they're in, where they spend their money, where they spend their time, what's important, what matters, the importance of family, physical connectivity with people. And so I think there's this really interesting where it's sort of part of the reason I think it feels exhausting is that we're gaining all these insights that we have to then deal with. And work out what it means for us. And of course, then, consumer behavior equals challenges for the people that serve those consumer behaviors. And how do they respond in a manner that's appropriate? And I think so to my mind, it's not really surprising in some respects that we've seen some of these other social issues emerge, because we're really reflecting on who we are and what we're about.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think, you make me think about another issue that there's good and bad, which is the issue of information. And science is exposing itself in all of its strengths and weaknesses right now. And people are desperate for understanding what's going on. We're desperate for control. And there are some ideological implications to COVID-19. So, for instance, COVID-19 requires kind of a collectivist, pro-social commitment to, some surrender of personal freedom in exchange for community benefit, and suddenly we're into an ideological conversation. Masks aren't just masks. Masks are politics. They are questions about freedom. They are questions about self-interest and community and risk perception and trade-offs, and it's not so simple. And it's a crucial time for our political leaders to understand how complex some of these requests actually are. And so then that can lead people to question the science. And we've seen that with other complex social challenges. For instance, there's a very interesting correlation between people's belief in climate change as an anthropogenic problem and their political orientation. People who are more independent like libertarian in nature, conservative in nature, small g government, are less likely to believe in climate change. And one of the contributing factors from the research is that if people are uncomfortable with the means to solving the end, they're uncomfortable with those means, then they're less likely to believe in the problem itself. And
right.
So we can't get on the same page about how to solve this problem because we have a fundamental disagreement about the problem itself. And so if people feel uncomfortable with, well, I don't like this thing because it impinges on our autonomy, it impinges on our ability to have an objective evaluation of the problem. Understanding how our mechanisms of belief work can allow us to strengthen our cooperation around these problems. And so maybe what we can do is let's find a way to agree on what we agree with. Do we want a healthy world? Do we want people to live in a clean environment? Do we want to live healthy and not have people who are high risk get exposure to a disease that's very violent for 15 to 20% of the people who get infected with it? Do we want people to be healthy and live in a clean world? Yes. Okay. Here's a path that I suggest. What's a path that you suggest to get there? And then we can find our ways to you do you in terms of approaches. Here are some approaches that I'll consider, and that way we start to unify different points of view that have an ideological difference that can align on this end goal.
Wow. I love that. That's just such a lovely way of looking at it because, as you say, the world is massively polarized on some pretty fundamental things. And it is quite scary to sort of look at that, those tribes that are appearing and it's kind of, things get seized upon that are probably not that big an issue, but they become totemic. And then, and as you rightly point out, it becomes an emotional tribal argument, and logic is not going to win here. And so it's fascinating to me that, brings us back to the sort of start of logical approaches to persuading people are often doomed to fail because we're not logical creatures. Yeah. And so we have to play in that kind of emotional engagement space. And I think it's fascinating looking at the political leaders that we have in some countries and, that are doing very well, where there is a degree of empathy and connection. And then we've got others, shall we say? I'll talk about the country I'm in as a good example of that, where there is much less of that. It's much more ideological, and that's not helping solve some of these fundamental human problems.
That's right. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do is find where our zone of agreement is. How far up the chain of human aspiration do we need to go? Find that place. So when you're disagreeing with a relative about systemic racism, or if you're disagreeing with a relative about COVID-19, or if you're disagreeing with them about issues like climate change, roll up that conversation until you find that thing where you both agree about what it is that you want. You want people to have healthy lives, happy lives, wealthy lives. We want our children to do well, to have fulfilling lives. Bring that conversation to the meta and start to talk about, what do you think would help us to achieve that? What do you think would help us have a stable economy, a stable society, and start to find where those points of agreement are. And then let's take into consideration different approaches that might help us achieve those shared goals.
And it's really interesting because I think that a lot of the anger, and it often is anger, is around feeling disenfranchised. Nobody is listening to me, so I'm going to go and vote for someone that is presenting me with solutions, which, if I thought about it, probably wouldn't be all the solutions. And I'm getting my voice back. I'm taking back control, stopping these evil people that are coming in. And I think that's a really interesting narrative there around empowerment. And of course, it fits perfectly with the theme of nobody likes being told what to do by other people and having no sense of agency. And yet it's a great analysis, because I think that's just, people just don't feel listened to. And if we can open those, if we can just give them a sense they're being listened to, I think that would be hugely powerful. What a lovely kind of uplifting way to think about things.
Yeah.
So I think on that note, because we need to finish on a high, and that was definitive. Thank you so much for some amazing insights. I mean, just so much to chew over, and thank you for a lovely, lovely story that I think illustrates supremely well that one should just kind of go for it and see what happens. And a little bit of risk taking is a good thing. And finally, thank you for kind of being a real advocate for behavioral science in general, because it's great to see people out there affecting change. Because whenever I'm having conversations with people, the question is, who else is doing this? And what you've nicely done is bridge that gap between academia, which is to sort of say, well, here's some stuff that's leveraging off some really detailed academic that people recognize, and saying it can actually make a huge difference in the real world. So thank you for that as well. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine, and thank you so much for your time.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Kelly for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Kelly and the work that she does at BEWorks, have a look in the show notes. There are links to their website and some of the projects that they're working on. If you're new to the Human Risk Podcast, you can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's on all of the major platforms. For more on human risk, do follow me on Twitter at Human Risk Blog, and subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter. Details of that also in the show notes. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. But in the meantime, stay safe, and thanks for listening.